whereas the simplest genomes for organisms that are free living, that can do everything necessary
not
to
only
live, are
is
bacteria.
science corrosive to religion is corrosive
the speed
to
of an
science.
object which is light years
All
away.
life on Earth uses the same
There
20
is
amino
no
acids.
right answer.
We are searching for intelligence.
The cosmos is all that is, or ever was, or ever will be.
Welcome everyone to the first edition of Universal Dialogues. What you're about to see is not quite a debate, not quite an interview, it's more like a conversation with some leading experts in the world of science. It will be a talk not only about astrobiology, but all what is around it. It will be a talk about life and the universe.
Hello and welcome everyone. My name is Joaquin, and along with Silvia, Marco and Luke, we formed the Astrobiology Society Committee here at the University of Manchester. We're also the founders of the society, and we did it in order to spread the word about astrobiology and reach the university community and enjoy all the best that this field has to offer. However, we haven't come this far alone. We want to thank all of our members for trusting us and for embarking with us in this journey. Without you, this wouldn't have been possible. So this event is also yours. That's why at the end of the event, we will be making some announcements about new features for the society. So stay tuned. We also want to remind you that this, aside from being one of the biggest events, one of the biggest online events in the history of the university, is also a fundraising event. We know that not everything is about space. There are issues here on Earth too. And that's why during the event, we will be raising money for the non-for-profit organization Ocean Genome Legacy, for their hard and invaluable work towards the preservation of our only home. We really want to say thank you on their behalf. So you can donate to them by clicking on the link that is pinned in the description, and the messages right in the donation page will be seen live, I think so, on the screen. So let's meet the people, Luke.
Sure thing. So with us this evening, we have a Professor of Physics at the University of Cambridge and winner of the 2019 Nobel Prize in Physics, Didier Queloz. We have Professor of Philosophy at the University of Boulder, Colorado, and the Director of the Center for the Study of Origins, CLELAND. Popular author, ethologist, and evolutionary biologist, Richard Dawkins. Professor of History of Science and Ideas at Lund University in Sweden, David Dunér. We have a chemist, physicist, science writer, and the editor of Nature for over 20 years, Philip Bull. And the CEO of New England Biolabs and winner of the 1993 Nobel Prize in Biology, Richard Roberts. So, shall we begin, Sylvia?
Yeah, okay. Before this event, we asked our guests to answer the question, what is life? But just in 3 words. To our surprise, the most common answer was that they didn't know or that they couldn't answer. And this gave us a lot to think about, and inevitably leads us to the first question I want to throw to our guests. What makes it so difficult to define life? And I would you like to start? Sorry, Carol.
Me? Did you? Yeah. Okay, good. I have a hard time with accents. Yes. So all of our experience with natural life, which is the only kind of life of which we can be certain, is with a single example, familiar life on Earth. And all known life on Earth descends from a last universal common ancestor, affectionately known to biologists as LUCA, the last universal common ancestor. And a biochemist has shown us that life could have been at least modestly different in its basic biomolecules. It could have used a different suite of amino acids to construct proteins, a different suite of nucleic acid bases to construct its nucleic acids. It could have used a different genetic code. It could have used a different coding schema, and not necessarily a triplet coding schema, maybe a duplex or a higher order coding schema. So the point is, we know we're dealing with a single example, and we don't know how different it could be. There are lots of theories about how life might be different in terms of its chemistry and, in terms of different kinds of nucleic acids or nucleic acid analogs, there are also some reason to believe that under conditions very different than were present at the time that life originated on Earth, you could say on Titan, with very little free oxygen, low temperatures, and no liquid water, that you could have had silicon make long polymers with the kind of complexity that could have given rise to biomolecules. We just don't know. We're dealing with a single example. And I like to give the example of a zebra. If you were trying to figure out, say aliens were here and they were trying to figure out what mammals were, and all they had was an example of zebras, what do you think they're going to pick? It's certainly not their mammary glands. Only half of zebras have mammary glands. It's going to be probably their stripes. But we now know that what half of zebras have, their mammary glands, are more important to what it is to be a mammal than their stripes. So this is just one example of how difficult it is. Logicians know this, but this is a good illustration just how difficult it is to actually safely generalize on the basis of a single example.
But since we're talking about astrobiology, we need to, as it were, sweep all that aside and say, if in the unlikely event that we were ever to get to another star, another planet, how would we recognize life if we saw it? And so we're not really asking to generalize from a set of facts about our one example. It's true we've got one example, which is life on this planet. We're asking, what criteria would we use to identify life in any world? And I actually rose to the challenge of 3 words. I said, evolved self-preserving complexity. I think it's got to be complex. Otherwise it's just something like rocks and sand and things like that. It's got to be complex, by which I mean statistically improbable. But statistically improbable has to be in a particular direction, which is an adaptive direction, a self-preserving direction, a beneficial direction, because otherwise any old heap of junk is statistically improbable. So it's got to be something that works to keep itself going, to keep itself in existence, to keep its complexity in existence. And I think it's got to have evolved, because I think there's no other way in which it could come about. If we were to encounter self-preserving complexity, which could be an artifact, like a computer or a plane or something, then there still has to be an evolved life form underpinning it.
So should I respond or let somebody else step in?
I think...
sorry, Rich, we cannot hear you. You are muted. So let's let Rich talk because he hasn't talked yet. Once he unmutes.
Yeah,
now.
Okay, so
Perfect.
I use the word ability to evolve, or the term ability to evolve, as being important. But for me, reproduction, ability to reproduce oneself, is really an essential element of life. That is, if it just sits there and is not able to reproduce, as far as I'm concerned, it's not life. So I think this is a key criteria as far as I'm concerned. I like the evolution and the complexity for me established. I thought of it in terms of metabolism. That is, the organism, if it's alive, then it's got to be able to metabolize and provide nutrients for itself by either ingesting minuscule nutrients or things that are not that complex, and then making them more complex. So I agree with Richard very much that complexity is really an important aspect here.
So I guess that this is actually an interesting point, because, I mean, in a sense, it's basically talking about when chemistry becomes biology. So, I mean, when do you, for example, I mean, in that case, something that obviously cannot self-reproduce, if we consider that that's not alive, for example, a virus, then that will be just like a bunch of chemical compounds instead of proper biology. So when is it that we observe this transition from chemistry into biology?
I think the replication is key. I actually started life as a chemist and only discovered biology when I was doing my PhD. But this replication, it seems to me, is key. Chemicals don't usually replicate themselves.
Absolutely. Replication is the key for evolution to get going. You can't get evolution without replication.
Right.
By the way, replication is not the same as reproduction.
Yes.
I think replication is what DNA does, or what an equivalent of DNA on other planets, presumably. Reproduction is something that individuals do, which is a different matter.
Can I interrupt in here, or shall I wait?
Yeah, sure.
Okay.
You wanted to say something before, so.
Can I? Did you say I can?
Yeah, that you wanted
Yes.
to
Okay.
say something.
Yeah. Okay. So I think that we have to distinguish carefully between a necessary condition for life and a sufficient condition for life. So I think we know things would be necessary, very general things that would be necessary for life, such as self-organized complexity. I have some doubts about reproduction, but I shouldn't go into them here. But self-organized complexity, I think, is required for life. But we see lots of abiotic systems that are self-organized. For example, look at hurricanes. They last longer than mayflies. I mean, we don't know when we're going to other worlds exactly what we're going to encounter. Already, planetary scientists have discovered things that are inexplicable. They can't understand them. On Mars, I could go into some details on this, on places like Titan, and the kinds of self-organized complexity that are possible in an abiotic world under certain chemical and physical conditions are something that we're liable to run into in non-living systems as well as living systems. So what I argue in my book, The Quest for a Universal Theory of Life, is that we ought to be not focusing on things like defining criteria and trying to thumbs up or thumbs down how we recognize it, but we ought to be looking for potentially biological anomalies using tentative criteria, which can use a suite of characteristics, including reproduction, but it's not now defining. We don't have to have that fight. What we do is look for systems that are different enough that it makes it less likely that they will be abiological systems.
Hurricanes are not complex.
No, I think you have to have complexity, and I think you have to have systems that are locally out of thermodynamic equilibrium, that are extracting energy from the environment to maintain their self-organization. I can't imagine a living thing that has not got that characteristics, but lots of non-living things on Earth maintain themselves by extracting energy from their hurricanes, tornadoes. I could go on, and we are running into things on other worlds that do that too. And we're surprised. We didn't think they would. It's just like they now, people like Schultz-Macak believe that, they've found that silicon, under very different conditions on Earth, can maintain can form long polymers. Now, does that mean that it's going to form biomolecules? Who knows? But the point is, there's a lot of stuff about the non-living world that we're going to encounter when we go to environments that are really different than those found on Earth.
Can I suggest, I think there's a real tension in astrobiology between what we should be looking for and how to define life, and those two things, of course, aren't equivalent. If we've heard that the possible definitions that people come up for life aren't a fingerprint that you will look for, in a snapshot. If you go down and analyze a sample from the surface of a planet or a moon, that's what you're looking at. If you have a living system of some sort that replicates but does so with a life cycle of a century, you're not going to see it. So the real problem is that we have to decide, or astrobiologists who are going out there and looking have to decide, is there a fingerprint that you can tell straight away, that there is something interesting here that looks like it might be life. I mean, we know that, very recently there was this big hullabaloo about the detection of phosphine gas or the alleged detection, it's being questioned, in the atmosphere of Venus, and that this was suggested as a biosignature because we don't know any systems on Earth, any geological systems that can produce phosphine. Now, that's very, very different sort of criterion, a single chemical that we don't know how else to produce, from looking for something that is complex? How do you measure complexity? What is the instantaneous signature of that? So I guess that's the tension that we're dealing with here, that, we can argue about what the definitions of life are. If you're looking in the atmosphere of an exoplanet and you just have a spectrograph of what that atmosphere looks like, is there anything in there that can tell you, or at least can suggest to you, that there may be life or not?
So you're talking about a diagnostic characteristic of life as opposed to a definition of life.
Absolutely.
That's a perfectly good distinction.
Yeah.
Maybe I can jump in here because I guess it's on my territory.
I was going to suggest that too, yeah.
Yeah, well, I think this is a very good point that Philip is mentioning here, because I think there is a big dividing line between the perspective from the biologist perspective that I fully understand, from the perspective that is the astrophysicist or the physicist part of it. The problem is, personally, I don't really care about the definition of life, because I think it looks more like dealing with definition of God, and it has of no use for me as an astrophysicist to use any definitions. What I do care is trying to define some facts that point to something that looks like life. And then we have a serious problem here, because there is 3 layers that we're dealing with in astrophysics. Well, the first one, which is a good one, we assume that the law of physics and law of chemistry are pretty much the same, whether it happens here or there. Now, the assumption that life is essentially a chemical reaction that takes control of the chemistry and is very greedy and dominates the chemistry going on, where when you have the chemistry going on, you don't end up making perfume, but it's being used to enhance life and develop life further. That's a kind of a principle that we can assume is going to happen anywhere, because it's still chemistry. Now, the problem here is what are the minimum conditions that you would expect to define a life possible, and what is the minimum condition you would define to be sure that you find life? Well, I personally find that the second aspect is almost an impossible job, because it's pretty sure that we have thousands of potential planets that we can look at, but there is a fact that is we're never going to go there. So we will have to rely on indirect detections, and we have to rely, as you mentioned, on the atmosphere of the planet. And then start an interesting game here, because when you start looking at the atmosphere of the planet, then you can look with something with the atmosphere on the Earth. And you look back at the history of the atmosphere of the Earth, you look back at the history of the atmosphere of Mars, and you look back at the history of Venus. And you ask yourself, and I think the first thing is interesting on that respect, because it tells a little bit the kind of process that people are going on, is how far could you be certain that there's life there? And even on Earth, it's not obvious that if you look on the Earth, you look at the Earth from the outside, whether you could be certain for sure that there is life on Earth. And that's the question for the chemist. So the astrophysics perspective is, I think, the idea that is an on-off scenario is not realistic. We will have a series of elements that will point for possibilities, but there is certainly something that we need to do, is we better have a good handling on the geophysics of the planet before we're going to deal with life. Takes Mars. There's a lot of interesting chemistry and chemical feature being detected on Mars, and there will be plenty of others with all the equipment now on Mars. Well, you can see that in many different ways, but that's pretty sure that you're going to learn a lot about the geophysical nature of Mars. Does it tell you anything about life? It's difficult to be really conclusive on that. So that's why I don't like definition here. I think life is part of a big puzzle. Life certainly had an impact on the Earth, had an impact on the atmosphere of the Earth. We would not have so much oxygen without life. It's not the only way to produce oxygen on the planet. You can very easily break a water molecule by the UV flux and produce oxygen and ozone. That's another mechanism, and it depends on the physical nature of the planet. So I think the problem is extremely complicated. That's why when I got the answer, can I define life? Well, I can rely on the biologists that are studying in great detail life as it is on Earth, and I'm pretty sure they come up with a good definition on life on Earth. whether it would be applicable to what's called life 2.0, if there is another life on Earth that would have survived somewhere, would that work? I don't know. But I tend to focus on the different element here, and maybe that's for later on, but I think we're starting from the wrong side. And in a way, I think astrobiology is starting from the wrong side by the kind of big stretch they're trying to do. I think stretching biology with astronomy is almost impossible. What could be possible is to stretch astronomy with geophysics, and geophysics with chemistry, and maybe chemistry is molecular biology, and molecular biology with life, assuming that all these steps, you can find ways to bridge them together. And in recently we have made some progress, I think, on some of the gap here. That is interesting because we've been told by some chemists, biochemists in Cambridge, by the way, that they seems to have a way to produce the amino acid on the surface of Earth. Well, there is plenty of condition which is being assumed, but these conditions are geophysical testable, so we can test them. We can test them on other planets. It doesn't tell you whether it's life, but at least we can test them. It doesn't tell you whether you cannot produce other kind of life, but again, it can be testable. So my focus right now is trying to understand by talking with as much people as I can. That's why I was very excited to be in this meeting, because I think there's a lot of brain here. How we can practically think about some kind of experimental setup that would help to find additional facts that would help us to understand the mechanic of life on the planet. And I think this is certainly an exciting, topic, and there will be, and there is already a growing interest for that topic, with the simple fact that we are visiting planet on the solar system and we'll be bringing stuff from Mars, and that will be very exciting. And we also we can measure the molecules and atmosphere of planet very far away, which is, I think, quite fascinating as a possibility.
I think, most of these topics is that we will try to cover them from now on, but just to raise this last thing on the perspective, on the side of defining life and the issues with this. So one of the things that you mentioned earlier, and you all mentioned somehow, is, well, aside from reproduction, this issue that may arise in the coming years with AI and machine learning and all these things. So I wanted to ask here, David, how do you think that this would fit in the future? So, for example, there's this hypothesis when you say that, for example, machine, AI intelligence somehow, or some kind of robot may be able to colonize future planets on a near future, and they will be able to reproduce from them onwards. So could we then consider that like proper reproduction? So that somehow would fit into some of the features of that life would have, that we have discussed now. So how do you think that AI fits into that field?
Yeah, it's about the question of the definition of life. If we will construct synthetic biology or artificial biology, artificial intelligence, would that be included in the concept of life? If it could reproduce and it could spread itself and it has a metabolism and maybe also going through an evolutionary process, would that be life? Of course, that's an hypothetical question, but
maybe not much.
Yeah, everything goes back to, from my perspective as a historian and philosopher, it goes back to the human mind and what we are using definitions for, and goes back to our conceptualization of the outer world. Everything depends on our human mind, and if our concepts are or fit into what is out there, that's the question. If so, life is something in our minds. From my perspective, it's a human conception. If that's is something out there also that is really fits into this concept, that's the challenge to find the fit between the concept and the outer world. Yeah. But if artificial intelligence would be a help for finding life, that's another question that could be discussed, of course.
Yeah.
Can I
Yeah,
can I
go.
respond? Since I'm a philosopher, I'd like to respond to that. So I think it's important when you talk about concepts in the head to make a distinction, which is very important in philosophy, first articulated by Saul Kripke and Hilary Putnam, between natural kind terms and artificial or non-natural kind terms. So bachelor, for example, is a humankind term. That is to say, there's no more to being a bachelor than our concept of bachelor. It's a conventional and cultural construct. But that's not true of natural kind terms. Consider, for example, water. That term applies to lots of stuff on Earth, and people have debated the nature of water for a long time. And if they had tried to define water, which would have been a mistake, before the work of Lavoisier and in the 19th century, the development of basically a periodic table, they thought of water as being liquid, transparent, and they were Aristotelians about this, and a fundamental, indivisible element. There is no way that analyzing the 17th century concept of water, you could have discovered H2O. It wasn't until we had the right theoretical framework that you could discover that. So the point I'm trying to make is it's not true, and this is what Putnam and Kripke established, it's not true that our concept of water is just a matter of our current understanding of water. Our current understanding of water is how we flesh it out, but we can still talk about water and change our concept of water. We can discover, for example, that during the early part, before the discovery of the periodic table, people thought that solutions of hydrochloric acid were water. They called them aqua regia. That's not an accident. And they had solutions of nitric acid were called aqua fortis because they were good solvents, and the alchemists thought being a good solvent was the essential property of water. We now know that they aren't water, but that it took a long time to get there. So it's not true that when you're talking about natural kinds, which presumably, but not certainly life is, that it's going to be just a matter of concepts in our head. Our current concept, and that's, by the way, a reason why definitions are so bad, because all a definition can do is extrapolate from the concept we already have of life or water. And if we're wrong, then we're going to go, because basically definitions give you necessary and sufficient conditions, and we're going to miss the really unusual forms of life that we might encounter on another world. That is to say, we'll classify it as not living because it doesn't satisfy our definition. That's why I've been arguing for tentative criteria. These are not defining criteria, and they are going to be a suite of different characteristics. So I agree with a lot of what I heard earlier, which would include the things that people who fight over whether it's metabolism or whether it's evolution or genes first or proteins first, include them in it and look for unusual spikes, things that shouldn't be there that look potentially biological, and then they're worthy of more scientific exploration for biology. But you're not going to, if you find an unusual form of life, which is what we should be looking for, you're not going to get a thumbs up or a thumbs down immediately if it's not like our form of life. If it is, then that you'll identify it. But if it's not, if it's the kind of thing we should be looking for, if we really want a universal theory of life, then it's not going to automatically be classified as living.
Carol, could I ask you? I wasn't quite sure from what you said then whether
one thing try
life is
with your arguments, because we have to move on to lots of more sections. So no, please go ahead, and I see that.
Send me an email. I'd love to discuss this further.
No. Please go ahead, and I've seen that.
And I have a paper in Astrobiology in 2019, a book that talks about this.
What I was interested to know is whether you were suggesting you think that life is or isn't a natural kind. Because
I think
these definitions that are given, it seems to be a collection of various things that matter seems able to do to organize itself or to replicate and so on, that happen to sort of come together and create us. and other things, but we can see a lot of those things in some respects in other systems too. So, you know, I wonder, that's probably not, it's certainly not an exhaustive list of things matter can do. And I wonder whether out of that, there necessarily comes any natural kind definition of life.
Well, I don't think you can't define water as H2O. Hillary Putnam established that. So natural kinds aren't the sorts of things that you supply necessary and sufficient conditions. You don't lock them in. If you would knock them in, then you could never discover that your theory applies to new cases. So I agree with you. You and I are in much greater agreement, perhaps, than you think. So I think that, but I do think that, you know, the question I think you're asking is life like quartz? That is to say, is it just chemistry that reaches us? You know, sometimes you get quartz under the right circumstances. Sometimes you get something else. Diamonds, for example. I don't know the answer to that, and I suspect that it is a consequence of chemistry. I actually have a paper on first offer in PNAS with Bob Hazen on this very issue. It's called, it's an evolution, it just came out in December, Evolutionary System of Mineralogy. So I think that you and I are not in agreement, but I don't think I know that much. That is to say, I think that we have a long way to go, and we need to look for examples that are different than our form of life, because our form of life is so similar that it's very hard to generalize. So we're actually in, I think, a lot of agreement.
Yeah, Richard wants to add something, I think.
And then we'll move on.
I think that that if we were to discover life on another planet, it would be the most exciting possible scientific discovery. I cannot imagine anything more exciting than that. What would be exciting about it? I think it would not be, I would not be excited to find the equivalent of a hurricane or a whirlpool or something like that. It would have to be really, really complex. Now, it's an interesting question whether an artifact, artificially complex object, like a computer, whether that would be called life. And now that's a matter of definition. I don't care about definitions like that. It would be very, very exciting if we found anything remotely like a computer or a car or a plane or something like that. That would be diagnostic of the presence of life, at least in the past. So for me, complexity is overwhelmingly the important criterion. That's what would excite me. That's what would get my blood running if we were to discover it. Now, as astrobiologists on this planet, we can't go to other planets at the moment. So we rely upon diagnostic features in the atmosphere, spectroscopic diagnoses, things like that, presence of oxygen, presence of water, that kind of thing. That's just what we have to do because we're stuck here on Earth and we can't actually go there. But if we could go there and we saw complexity on the scale of life or on the scale of a computer or a plane or a car, we would instantly be captivated. We'd be overwhelmed by the experience of finding something as complex as that. And something like a hurricane or a whirlpool doesn't do that.
Let me ask a question. Would it have to be something that sort of continued to reproduce? What if it was a computer like HAL that clearly could do very special things, complex, but maybe it never wanted to reproduce itself. Maybe it didn't need to.
I get that. But HAL could only have come about by an evolved life form. So it would be a kind of non-reproducing entity in itself. It couldn't be there unless there was a reproducing, replicating, evolving entity to make it in the first place.
But maybe it already got rid of the.
So I mean, this discussion could go on for hours, but we have other arguments to cover. So we would like now to explore, like, obviously we are basically talking about hypotheses and things that obviously are not confirmed yet, and that we don't even know if we will be able to confirm them at some point. So this is this is the question, if there is life elsewhere, where is it, right? So why we haven't detected it yet? So obviously there are three kind of different scenarios to this question. Basically, we can actually be alone, or maybe there might be simple life and somehow we haven't contacted it yet. we haven't detected it yet because obviously it's not like a developed civilization as we are, or maybe there are actual civilizations, but for some reason the contact hasn't been made yet. So we would like to focus on that first, on this first argument. So imagine that there is no life elsewhere in the universe. We are literally the only ones. What does this mean? Why? What are the implications of this?
It would mean that if we are the only life form in the universe, if there are 10 to the 22 stars in the universe and we can see, it would mean that the origin of life on this planet is a stupendously improbable event, because otherwise, I mean, do you see what I mean? And I don't believe that, but it's a fascinating thought. If you're one of those people who thinks we are alone in the universe, then you are committed to the view that the origin of life on this planet is such a rare event, such an improbable event, that we're wasting our time even trying to reconstruct it, because it's got to be, we're not looking for a probable, plausible theory, we're looking for a highly implausible theory if we're alone. Of course, I don't believe we are alone.
So I can't believe that for a couple of simple arguments. I mean, if you assume that the beginning of life is a chemical process that at some point becomes biology, I don't see why that this chemistry is not happening everywhere. And there's nothing very special. There is plenty of all the elements that we are using for life. They produce in an infinite way into stars, and there are an infinite number of stars when you really look at this way. So
I agree with you. That's what I'm saying.
No, but the problem here is there is two problems we have. I think the first one that we should maybe try to kill is it is tremendously difficult. This is where tremendous should be used to detect life. That's another story here. It's not about the fact there is plenty of life everywhere.
Yeah.
The fact it's difficult. And it's just look at the easiest possible places where you can imagine finding life, that is Mars. Well, it's not easy to find life on Mars. There may be life there. Imagine there is life which is deep down 1 kilometer down in the crust of Mars. Well, how long do you think we need to build up the technology to do that? How many 100 years we need to do that? So it is really difficult. Now, there may be life in many ways, and just look at the Earth. If you look at the Earth, I just take the example of the Earth because that's the only one we know. So it's a good example. So if you look at the Earth, but you look back in the past, if you look at the solar system, you would have seen Venus, Earth, Mars, 3 blue planets, essentially. They had water, they had ocean at that time, all of the 3. There is no doubt about that. Well, do you think you would have detected a hint of life in any of this planet? No, it would have been invisible to just detect it. So the problem we're talking here, it's a practical difficulty. The distance between the stars is beyond the biological world. I mean, you cannot, as a biological entity, imagine how far it is. It is a similar kind of perception you get if you ask yourself, how many cells do you have in your body? It's impossible to get the perception. We have this feeling that we are uniquely built with a single consciousness. Well, actually, we have a fantastic makeup of dozens of different cells that operate together and talk together and specialize together. So I think this perception that the humankind, the consciousness, has the ability to perceive such a vastness is just wrong. So I think this is a wrong problem. I think there is not an issue about this fact. There may be plenty of life. We're just not good enough to detect it. That's it.
Okay, but one point to make there is if there is life elsewhere, it may be way more advanced than we are. So, we always assume we're pretty advanced, but we could be absolutely like bacteria as far as life elsewhere is concerned. And if life elsewhere does exist, maybe they will send out signals and try to communicate with others to see if something is out there, just as we have started to do.
If we ever do discover them, then they will be more advanced than us because
they will.
It'll be they who reach us.
Yes, that's what I think too.
Yeah, but that is another topic.
think-
That's another topic we're talking
Another
about.
topic,
It's the survival of an advanced civilization, which, seeing what we see these days, I think we are not optimistic. I'm not very optimistic on the possibility to survive 1,000 years, where we barely had 30 years with enough thermonuclear weaponry that can fire up at any instant over the world. So I think the possibility that our civilization, the way we operate right now, will survive 1,000 years is zero at this stage. That's my perception. We have to change something because we're deadly dangerous to ourselves.
Yeah, but the bacteria will survive.
So,
Yeah, but they won't travel. They won't send you signal.
David wanted to add
I'd
something
like to
from a long
interrupt
while
here.
ago. David wanted to add something. So
I'd like to interrupt here because I think we have to keep a perspective that most of the period of the history of Earth has been a period of microbial life. It is only in less than 1 billion years that we got complex multicellular eukaryotes. So it's very possible that most life in the universe is single celled, bacterial or archaean type life, probably not exactly like that. And it seems like it's kind of hard to make multicellular creatures, animals and plants like us, because they arose very late. And, there was a huge gap of time. And then I also agree with what somebody said earlier that I think that there's also the issue of how much technological life that we can actually communicate there is in the universe. My suspicion is that technological life destroys itself. That is to say, look where we're going. I agree with that completely. I think that the survival, I think it's probably some of it just probabilistically survives. But I think that you're going to go out and if you have the techniques to get around all of these problems we discussed, you're looking at distant planets around other stars and you're looking at their atmospheres and you find atmospheric evidence that was really strongly suggestive of biology. It's still probably going to be microbial. I mean, that's what happened on Earth with the great oxygenation event, right? Then you could have detected oxygen in the environment, and there may be other kinds of chemicals you can detect and conclude that, hey, this is more likely biology than some of these exotic chemical reactions that also produce oxygen. But to get technological life to survive this period is, strikes me that from our own experience, it's very hard. And then there are the vast distances between stars. Everybody has ramjets in their mind, but, are we really going to build them? Are we going to put people on spaceships that are going to survive to go to the nearest star? I mean, the nearest star isn't very far away. I mean, it's very far away, but it's nothing compared to the other stars. So I just think we have a problem.
I think you had something to say from the early beginning. I'm pretty sure that you would like to add something to this conversation. So go ahead.
Let me add something here on this conversation. I think another problem about life is that we need only one sample of another kind of life, and we know that we are not alone. But we will never be able to answer if we are alone in the universe, that there are no life out there in the universe. We couldn't possibly search for life everywhere in the universe and look under every stone in every corner in the universe. We will never know that question, or we'll never be able to answer it or say that we are alone. But we need just one example of life in order to be able to say that we are one species or one life form among other life forms. So that's I think it's important to, and as Carol said about more advanced complex life, technological societies or civilizations, I think also that they are self-destructive. If we would find a technological society, it should be have survived for a long period of time in order to enhance the possibility to detect it. So, but if technological societies are short-lived or self-destructive, perhaps they could last just for 100 years or 1,000 years, then it would be much more difficult to find them. And the reason I would say is that it's much easier for an intelligent creature to construct technology for destruction, like the atomic bomb or technology that changed the climate or other technologies. That's much easier than to agree on to agree on the climate, how we should treat the climate, and come up with a climate agreement. It's much more difficult and complex, and much more difficult. So we will destroy ourselves before we are able to find a way of collaboration for survival.
Could I just ask people, in this context, I'm always very wary about how easily we tend to fall into assuming that other civilizations will be like us, only cleverer. They'll have all the same motivations, all the same foibles and so on, but just better technology. I think there's a real danger that we tend to think that way. And I just wonder what people on this panel think about the notion that if there are other minds, is there anything we feel we could say about them on the assumption, let's say, that they are Darwinian, that they have evolved by Darwinian evolution? Is there any likelihood that mere process, process that creates them, is going to produce similarities in some senses to the way we are through convergent evolution? Or should we just accept that we can say nothing meaningful about what other minds might be like?
If we were ever to meet them, either if they reached us or we reached them, they would have to have a knowledge of physics, they would have to have mathematics, they would have Pythagoras' theorem, they would have something like the same mathematics as we've got, the same physics as we've got. So I think we could say, they would have logic, they'd be able to reason because it works. And so if they didn't have that, they wouldn't get here. And I think you could at least say that, couldn't you?
Yeah. And probably they are adapted to a certain environment. If that environment is similar to ours, that could be a basis for some similarities. They should be an evolving creature, probably, have evolved through a biological evolution. But it is also, what is crucial here, I think, is the concept of culture. That they have evolved a culture, a means of transferring information between themselves that don't use the genome or genetic processes. And the culture is made on conventions and symbols, and that could be very, very different from what we understand. And even though they have the same knowledge about mathematics and physics and technology, they would probably express this knowledge in a very different way that is based on their culture and history. So we have to make a difference between the expression and the content of for example, their knowledge.
I have a comment which is more a question, actually, because I've always been fascinated by this, and that's always something I realize when I'm talking to biologists. There is this preconception that life will lead to consciousness. I mean, is that really something that is really kind of common understanding? Because you can imagine life without consciousness. In this case, I think the consciousness is a prerequisite for mathematics. Otherwise, I don't see how you can elaborate mathematics without consciousness. So there is a link here when we make assumption of saying intelligent life, all this about this element. And And even if you accept the evolution, which seems to be more like a mathematical element, the evolution will I mean, if you do a chemistry experiment, I mean, there are some reactions which are faster than others. Well, this is Darwinian in a way, already at that level, even if you don't have life. So I think the idea of the selections and optimization seems to be embedded in many ways into the nature world. But the idea of consciousness is kind of a weird element here. So I would very much hear about what the biologists or maybe the philosopher have to say about that, because I'm really curious.
So can I respond? Just briefly, philosophers are completely puzzled by consciousness in the sense that it's normally met. Nobody really, I don't think, understands it. If you mean by consciousness just self-referentiality or the ability to, reference yourself, cats and my cat does that kind of thing. My cat seems to be have a minimal sense of self-awareness, and I doubt if it's just something humans have, that they evolved in some kind of magical emergent property that other animals don't have. I would think there's a continuum, especially among mammals. But I actually wanted to respond to Philip's question because I thought it was really interesting about Darwinian evolution. Among multicellular organisms, animals in particular, Darwinian evolution is all about the competition for vital resources. And so I think if you think of all intelligent life or all advanced life being Darwinian, then you have this difficulty that's very competitive. But we can get hope with the microbial world, because the microbial world, which doesn't involve this kind of vertical gene transfer as the dominant mode of genetic change, involves horizontal gene transfer, and microbial communities are very cooperative. They do not compete. You have low abundance microbes that don't compete with the high abundance. They have their little niches. And so it's not clear to me that, there are questions about whether evolution in the microbial world, you can stuff it into a Darwinian box, but there are more and more philosophers of biology and some biologists who are beginning to think, maybe Lamarck had something right here. I mean, it's a different kind. You have the transfer directly among bacteria. There's some evidence for mutator genes, that certain genes are more subject to mutation than others, and the genes that are subject to mutations are the ones that are going to be the most advantageous given environmental change, such as antibiotics or lactose or lactose deficiency. So it seems to me that that gives us our biggest hope for maybe there being aliens that exploit a sort of less, shall we say, aggressive, bloody of tooth and claw form of Darwinian evolution. But I think that if you think in terms of animals and Darwinian evolution as we know it, and if that's required for making a technological civilization, then I think most of them are self-destructive. And also you don't want to run into them.
So,
sorry, go on.
One of our followers on Instagram actually asked us a question. Vaishnavi Devarakonda asked us, life is considered as a unique event in the universe, and also it's the most complex thing that we understand. Earth is the only known planet to support life, and if life was found on other planets, it would be a miracle. Life forms that exist there could answer lots of questions that we're looking for. So what could discovering life elsewhere tell us about life on Earth? And I think we've touched on some of these points already. But say we discovered, say, from atmospheric traces, or even if we were directly contacted, what could this tell us about life on Earth?
Well, I mean, the astrophysics perspective is very simple. I think the assumption is you must have plenty of life development a bit everywhere. It's enough to demonstrate that there is at least one, and that's it. And then you open the Pandora box.
I mean, this is the curious thing about the detection of life on another planet. It seems to me that you only need to find one other example to be pretty confident that life is everywhere.
Yeah,
it's very rare in science that is true, that two examples means it's everywhere. But in this case, it does.
Yeah. That's exactly what we're planning to do. I mean, the plan is to observe about 100 stars around where we will have a planet like the Earth, because we're looking for this planet. We have a few, but not exactly the one we want, but we've not looked carefully enough. But in the next 50 years, we will have a good picture or which star has a planetary system that kind of meet the criteria that's called for habitability, which is the minimum criteria, like at least you get liquid water. And then you will look at the atmosphere, and we will look later if there is some continent, and all this will be possible. You don't break the law of physics to do that. It's kind of an easy things to do, much more easier than traveling to other stars. And by this, the hope is we will detect, as it has been mentioned, a hint, a blip, something that is awkward. You know, when you look at the stromatolite, it's on Earth, the origin of the first evidence for life on Earth. So what are you looking at? You're looking for tiny bits of something that doesn't make any sense from the pure chemistry of geophysics. That's it. And that's enough to conclude that something different has happened, doesn't fit into the regular geophysical pattern. Well, we're doing the same, but instead of looking at the detail of one piece of stone or what element here, we're just looking at the global planet as a whole. So the planet is an element when you look something awkward. So what does it mean? Well, it would be for the next generation to find out, but I'm pretty sure people will be very curious about the geophysical pattern of this planet and will be very careful about detecting and picking up any strange chemistry that they would not understand by regular geophysical mechanism, like is going to happen on Mars. I mean, the Mars, soon there will be a robot looking at the detailed geophysics. It's not a life experiment at all. They are not going to look for life, but they're going to do better than that. They're going to look for the detailed chemistry at some specific element on Mars, with the idea that something awkward will be visible, because there has been some predictions. If there are some life organism, it has some effect on the geochemical compositions of the soil of Mars. So you may expect to see something on the basis of what we know on Earth. And we find some evidence that it looks like the origin of life on Earth, then it will be an interesting debate whether life started on Mars and went to Earth, and then the life on Earth went to Mars, or it's completely different kind of mechanism that turns out to have a kind of convergent element. I think this is what we're doing. This is a fascinating moment because we're not anymore talking about the definition of life. We are building facts. It will be a gradual element. It will not be that and that, like was mentioned clearly by Carol. I think it will be a gradual build-up with some kind of statistical assessments of a likelihood to be related to life. But this is happening today. That's a fascinating moment we're experiencing right now.
Could I ask chemists present, as I always wanted to ask, can we already say, for example, that life has got to be carbon-based? And if so, I mean, I once asked Harry Croter that, and he said, yes, it's got to be carbon-based. Has it got to be protein-based? I mean, protein is something very special. Protein has this capacity to form itself into highly differentiated three-dimensional structures which catalyze the whole of life. Must it be protein-based? Must it be nucleic acids? That kind of thing. That's the kind of question I'm interested in, which I think chemists can already answer without going to other planets. They can already say, imagine an alternative biochemistry that's not carbon-based. Imagine an alternative biochemistry that's not protein-based. Do chemists present have something to say about that?
Well, I think I would. I liked Harry very much. He was a very good friend. We both were from Sheffield. But I think all you can really say is that from everything we know about life on Earth, it looks as though carbon is essential. However, I wouldn't go so far as to say that elsewhere there might not be another form based on silicon or based upon some other element. So all we can say, I think, is that from what we know about life on Earth and what we've been able to detect, it really does need to be carbon-based.
Of course, chemically, what we've tended to look for, what NASA certainly has tended to look for, is water. And, you know, that's the other question. Does it have to be water?
Then I can mention some astrophysical perspective on that. I mean, it's not even dealing with the detail of the chemistry. I think there is just simple fact. You can look already what you have the most. And water is everywhere. There's a good reason why there is plenty of water, because oxygen is being produced inside stars, and then hydrogen is everywhere because that's a universe essentially. And hydrogen plus oxygen makes water. So you point already your telescope anywhere in the sky when there are a kind of what's called a globular cluster, it's full of water. So water is obvious. So the other thing you see with water, it's carbon. Or you see even better, we see alcohol. We see chain of alcohol everywhere in the universe. Why? Because you need carbon. Carbon is being produced into stars, and carbon with oxygen and hydrogen is start to making long chain of alcohol. So they are everywhere, this. So I think if I would be making life, I would be rather stupid not to use what is everywhere available. And it turned out that carbon is a fantastic molecule to build up anything I like, because it's a big kind of Lego machinery, or the Swiss knife of chemistry. So you can imagine life plenty of different ways, but look, it's very simple to make it from these few elements you have already around, just because this is what you have plentiful. And we've seen that. There's no magic there.
So are you saying there are no planets that lack a lot of water and a lot of carbon?
No, carbon is the easy bits, because any planet, when you form a planet, you will have tons of carbon that is going to be seen in the atmosphere. So the pristine atmosphere you got when you build a rocky planet will be a CO2 full of atmosphere. It's a kind of a Venus-like atmosphere you get. But of course, this is evolving because the crust of the planet is evolving, the geochemistry of the planet is evolving. You may have some kind of volcanic activity, then you recycle, then the carbonate. So you start to a lot of slow cycling here that is going to gradually change a bit. But a CO2 atmosphere, carbon, is plentiful. Now, water is everywhere as well. But the problem of water, it's very easy to become a gas. So when you start making a lot of gas of the water, you may be in a situation where the gas will just evaporate from the planet. And if the planet is not massive enough, or there is too much irradiation on the planet, you're going to lose it. So the history of an atmosphere of a planet, and then if you have an atmosphere of gas, of water, you will have an imbalance, a chemistry imbalance with a solid, with a liquid part you have due to the pressure and the gas is kind of balanced here, will depend a lot of conditions you have on the planet. And also bear in mind that the planet is not completely isolated, because when you form a planet, there is a lot of stuff in your systems, and you have a lot of material falling on the planet. And these materials tend to come from farther out. It's very icy. It's full of fascinating molecule like HCN, which seems as a building blocks to initiate the nucleic acid, my understanding, according to what my friend chemists are telling me. So this is falling by dozen on the planet early on. So you have a kind of a active chemistry with the size of the planet. So imagine your lab with the size of the planet, with a lot of stuff going on with water, carbon, volcanic activity, material falling on. And this is from this soup of activity that you have a lot of possibility. So what is a bit magical here is, how come do you make life? Because you can make up a lot of interesting chemistry, I'm pretty sure, but a lot of chemistry going on doesn't lead to life. So there must be something which is driving to the life. And this new theory, when you tend to build this 20 amino acid just by a natural process of putting all these elements together, is an interesting way to suggest that naturally, when you have this element, you're making all the building blocks. So life seems to be almost everywhere. So you form life on any planet. Now, whether you evolve it, whether you lose it, whether you lose the atmosphere, whether something happened and it's going to destroy life, like on Venus. I mean, look, must have been life on Venus. Venus was exactly the same than Earth. You just go back 1 billion years old ago, it was a blue planet like us. Now, Mars is fascinating because the first billion years old had ocean there. So by looking at these planets, we get a better perspective on this element about how likely it is that when you have the ingredient to form life, you're going actually to make it and you're going to keep it. And it's not only making life, which is critical, is what do you need to maintain it and to sustain it? And then I was asking the question of the evolution and the possibility to end up with a life like us, which is another story.
Can I please interrupt? Can I interrupt? How about Titan? Very little, if no water, lots of organic molecules,
fully agree.
Methane.
Titan with there is another satellite called Enceladus, which is fascinating for the geophysicist, because we know that there are liquid water there and maybe other stuff, and we know that is in liquid form. The only difficulty here is under a crust of ice, and we need to dig down and to understand. Enceladus is a bit easier because of the volcanic activity you have it. You see ejection plumes of liquid.
We're talking about Titan here.
But
Titan.
no, a Titan you have to drill. So we may need to.
No, but you have oceans of ethane and methane. You have solvents on the surface that are not liquid water, but you have a lot of organic molecules.
Okay, fine. But it doesn't sustain because it evaporates. You cannot keep it. You have to keep under pressure if you want to make it.
You don't think you have liquid oceans of ethane and methane? That's what I've heard.
I don't know. I have no idea. I've never seen evidence for that. But the point about Titan and Enceladus is good because here you have a completely different chemistry compared to what you would expect to have on Mars and Earth and Venus. In that case, I think there are obvious sites to go and to have a look. And I think there are plans to have a look to Titan and to fly into the plumes and Enceladus. And it would certainly be very helpful. I would love to see some sophisticated organic chemistry then going on, but organic chemistry is not life. Again, I always use this example of perfume. And when you make a great perfume, it's sophisticated chemistry that you're using to do that. It's not life.
The key step is replication. None of it.
I agree.
Well, I am a physicist, so maybe I should leave the biologists talking. But to me, when life starts, is when you have a replication and evolutions. That's what defines life to me. Yes. If you just replicate, you don't get any life. You have to just.
It's a very big step. It's a very big step.
And then there is this idea of the complexity that comes in play, where you grow the complexity from an aliveness object and then an entity, and you become more and more alive. And then there is a point when you're fully alive. But I see that from a very simple physicist perspective. That may be completely wrong, but that's the way I see it.
So now that we're more or less touching that topic of what is necessary actually to form a life, and we concluded from the beginning that no one here really likes definitions as a concept. But I think that we should all admit that definitions are useful for for their practicality somehow. So
definitions aren't useful. What they do is they blind you. Because when you have a definition, you divide the world up into A and not A. So if you have something that is outside the definition at all, because they provide necessary and sufficient conditions, it just gets dumped. So I don't think they're useful. I think that they are actually linkers.
Precisely for that reason, I wanted to ask all of you now that to end this meeting. What would you think about maybe considering in a close future maybe artificial intelligences or other kind of non-organic entities that might end up having something very similar to a consciousness, that is something that you mentioned before, that might be a necessity for life, and that might be able to evolve, not in the same way that we do, but in a different way, but evolve nonetheless, and that are able to replicate themselves. What would you think about considering them living forms as well?
Could I say something about that? First of all, I know that there are several people, probably many people in SETI, who believe that if we contact another civilization, it is overwhelmingly probable that it will be artificial. Because we seem to be going that way. We may have a few more 100 years before that's true of us. I think if that's true, the interesting question to me is: would we be able to deduce anything from the nature of that artificial intelligence about the living systems that created it, as they surely would have done in the first place?
Yeah. So, and actually, another question that I find quite deep is what if actually that civilization that ends up being fully artificial somehow is humankind? What if our descendants are literally artificial intelligence created by ourselves and are the ones who are able to explore the universe? What are your thoughts on this matter? Any of you? Maybe Didier?
Well, I think you're asking the question what's called the post-human aspect of here. I don't think I have anything clever to say here. I think you can imagine anything you like on that premise. The only thing I can say today, I find the computer pretty stupid, and I find this AI software even more stupid. They're pretty good at solving something simple like a chess play. But the brain is kind of amazing because it's very light, it's very compact, and the possibility of the brain is I cannot even count it compared to what computer can do. So I do have difficulty to understand the concept of artificial intelligence, but maybe it's because I'm not sure we agree on what we understand as intelligence here. That's maybe why. So I don't think I can say anything more.
Interesting question to explore. I mean, yeah, because well, it's basically related to SETI as we have introduced, and I would like to ask this question to you, David, because I know that you have a lot of background on this. So, I mean, there's always this duality. So, basically, should we somehow cause that contact? So, should we wait? Should we wait until someone comes here and tell us, hey, here we are, or should we wait until we passively somehow find them, or should we do it in an active way?
Yeah, that's a huge debate in the SETI community. The people who are in search for extraterrestrial intelligence, and they were in December last year, just less than 2 months ago, there were announced about a signal from Alpha Centauri called BLC-1 that some people said was an artificial signal from a civilization. And the first question was if it's artificial or a natural signal that has a natural origin. But that started debate if this would be an original, true signal from a technological society. Should we respond, or should we try to hide ourselves? Because we, in our own history on Earth, we know that cultural contacts have many times been lethal or dangerous for the part that is less developed. So many people are feared that we should not respond to a signal, and we should never send a message out in space. Because
how long would it take them to reach us, though? I mean, we're pretty safe, aren't we? Just the sheer barrier of great distances of space.
Yeah, the great difference distances in space. But if we take, for example, Alpha Centauri, a message would take 4 years.
Yes, but then for them to come here and eat us, or whatever we're afraid of.
Yeah, if they have such a complex technology that they could travel to our planet and reach us and eat us, then many people would be dangerous. But so that's perhaps says more about our own fears than perhaps a real danger. And in fact, it's already too late in that respect. If the extraterrestrials want to get us or to destroy us, they already know that we exist, because from our Earth, it has leaked out electromagnetic radio waves for 100 years now. So we are already detectable. So
but it's probably not a good thing to put evil motives on everybody other than ourselves just because we have them.
Yeah. So we don't know if they are dangerous or if they are evil or friendly. No. That's just about ourselves and our own fears.
Could I just? I want to take this opportunity to ask Didier in particular before the chance goes. Yeah, what do you feel are the prospects within our lifetimes of finding an exoplanet on which there is some kind of consensus that life probably exists there?
A consensus? Zero. Because, but look, I mean, look, we had an interesting story is when this meteoritic, I can't remember the name, from Mars was studied a couple of years ago, when there was this big claim. They even had an announcement by the president of the United States that they found evidence for alien life on Mars, and so. And it was a big burst in the media, and everything faded down away. And at that case, we had a real piece of rock with all the technology you can imagine on Earth to study this piece of rock with great detail. And even then, it was a big controversy, and it went crazy in the media. And I think the difficulty in that game, I think the history of BLC1 in Proxima is a good example. I mean, if you want to see it, you see what you like. I mean, the BLC light and radio signal is very likely to be related to flaring activity. Proxima, it's a highly flaring activity. It is something you see every day, and it has never been peer reviewed. It's just been dumped into the media like that because it's cool, it's exciting, and stimulating, because there's a lot of emotional element. And I fully understand that. I have no problem with this emotional element. We are emotional beasts. We are irrational beasts. We believe into magic, mysteries, God, all that kind of stuff. This is where we build. Fine enough. But the real question here is who do you start addressing this in a way that you build up fact? And I'm sorry to disappoint you. I think the fact, there will be fact, but this fact will be always debated. It will take a long time. The only serious chance we have to detect life and reaching kind of a consensus is to be looking for life on Mars, because we have a practical experimental in place, which is going to bring back something. And then maybe in 30 years, we will have at least understood what is the likelihood that we had some life on Mars, or we had kind of similar pattern than Earth, or we actually do detect. Maybe it's a big piece of luck. Maybe we're going to see something. I don't really know. It's really a unique chance to bring something really from Mars there. But when you look at another planet, I think the idea is more building up a pattern. And the pattern is to understand, I mean, how likely it is to get a planet that looks about like the Earth. I mean, with a kind of a density like the Earth, with maybe a kind of an atmosphere like the Earth, maybe find evidence for water on this planet, and so on and so on. And I think this is going to happen, because I don't see any reason why we break any law of physics, which is very different than traveling between other stars. I mean, you mentioned that it's only 4 years to travel to Proxima Centauri. Yes, if you are a photon and have zero mass. But as soon as you get a mass, it becomes a little bit annoying, because your mass tends to grow pretty exponential as soon as you get close to the speed of light. So I think there is a really practical element here about traveling between stars, which is an immense difficulty, because you're breaking law of physics. And up to now, a lot of people have challenged Einstein theory, but they have been proven wrong. And people will continue trying to challenge it, because it's part of the physical world. But I think we should give up on the idea that it's easy to travel with a biological entity between stars. No, but we should not give up on trying to build up a pattern. And we have good reason to believe that we will build a pattern. And hopefully, maybe between 20 to 50 years, we will have some hint that will possibly lead to some statistical evidence that something is going on. But being for sure, I'm sorry, I don't think it's going to be possible.
Well, as we are reaching the end of this meeting, I wanted to ask you another question. What do you think that could be the social reaction to the encounter of some kind of extraterrestrial life?
Yeah, if we find microbes on Mars, that might be some headlines in the newspapers, but after a couple of days, people will be not so satisfied or interested anymore about that news. But if we find intelligent life, that might be interesting for more people. But I would guess that there are a lot of facts that we get, a lot of knowledge that we get, but the main reaction is to to forget it or not to be interested in it. So maybe the reaction would not be so huge as we perhaps believe.
Let me give you another perspective on that. When you just look at the society where we're living, to understand the impact of the knowledge, we are essentially a fully knowledge-based society. Anything we're doing is based on something we've learned in the last 300 and 400 years, essentially. Anything, from what we eat, from what we travel, from what we communicate. And you can think on your cell phone, you can think on anything you have in mind. It's fully knowledge-based. Well, it's surprising, with so much knowledge, the brain, the perspective, the magical world we're evolving, the psychological pattern we have as a society doesn't look to be much affected by all this knowledge, because we keep thinking as if we didn't know all that. So we have an amazing capability to not picture all this knowledge. And that's very difficult, maybe, for us to really wait and draw the consequence. There has been some consequences. There has been some elements that have been digested in the society. One of the best examples is, it is often said that when the Newton started to elaborate its theory, it must have had some impact on the fact that you can understand the world about the society, and the society should have also some organizations. And it is mentioned that it had inspired revolutions and for democratic idea. I don't know if it's right, but certainly in terms of timing, it works. And there may be some effect like that. But the time for the society to respond to that and what exactly you will end up is difficult to wait, because you're more talking about the problem of the psychology and the social reaction. And I think in terms of science and knowledge, asking for extraterrestrial intelligence or looking for that it is as interesting to study the psychological response that we're having, or the psychology of mind, or how we perceive that indeed to be looking for it, because there is as much telling you about the fact that we're doing that. It looks in a bit irrational for the first instance to do that. And in a way, this is telling us a lot about what we are. And that is fascinating question. So I think there is a lot to do here on the psychology and a social perspective of that element.
We could be talking about this stuff like ages, as with any other question. And as we're running out of time, and I personally wanted to ask if we are ready for discovering new life forms from outside Earth. But as I said, we don't have much time. I would prefer to ask a question that has a briefer answer, which is what Graham Lau asked in the comment section. He said, a fun question to ask anyone is whether they trust their political leaders to speak on their planet's behalf. Do you trust your political leaders to ask to speak on the planet's behalf? What's your answer to that? Any of you can answer.
No.
Okay. That's plain. Any of the others?
Carl Sagan had a chapter heading which is Who Speaks for Earth? And my feeling was nobody better than Carl Sagan himself could speak for Earth.
Right. David Attenborough does quite a good job.
David Attenborough, excellent, yes.
Well, but if the extraterrestrial are like fish, we should better let the fish talking.
So, Luke, I think it's your turn.
Yeah, that's great. That's probably all we've got time for today, but thanks to all our viewers for showing up. Please follow us on Instagram and Facebook and all that. And any University of Manchester students, you can become a member of the Society on the Students' Union website. Please also, if this is your last chance, to donate to the OGL charity that we're raising money for. So just before you leave, we do have one quick last announcement to make.
Yeah, so this is going to be interesting for any student who wants to know more about astrobiology, wants to be more involved in the society. So the announcement is that
this discussion after it.
Yeah. So we are creating a Discord server where you will be able to talk between each other. You will be able to ask questions about astrobiology, and we will be very focused on answering everything, and we'll create a very beautiful community. So that's all from me. Luke?
Yeah, and last but not least, so obviously, as you know, if you're one of our members in September, we are doing our events on Thursdays, which means that next Thursday we have another event which is going to be, as you know, about Perseverance landing on Mars. So we are going to watch it live if you want to join, and we are also going to debate about what can be found over there. So feel free to join us if you want, and we will probably post more information about it on Monday, and we will also include it on our newsletter on Wednesdays, as you know. So if you want to stay tuned with us, just as Luke said, follow us and sign up for the society.
That's great. Thanks everyone for coming.
Thank you very much.
See you all soon.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Bye.